Okay, good morning, everybody. Welcome to this first session in a series of conversations about the attacks on journalists in Mexico, hosted by the Center for U.S.-Mexican Studies at UC San Diego and its director, Rafael Fernandez de Castro, together with the San Diego Union-Tribune. I'm Jeff Light, the editor and publisher of the Union-Tribune. Today, we're going to discuss the broad outlines of this crisis and the implications at the border and in the capitals of both countries. Our goal in this series is to hear from journalists, to analyze this violence, and to propose solutions. And by the end of the series, we will again co-host the second Journalism Awards of Baja California, brought together by UC San Diego and the Union-Tribune to recognize and encourage in-depth journalism and to support the journalists of the border region. Now, as we get going, briefly, I just wanted to add a question that might arise in today's conversation. I've asked myself, as a journalist, to what extent is our focus on this topic born out of self-interest? Because when you think about it, thousands of people literally are murdered each year in Tijuana. And yet now with these murders of journalists, the whole climate of our coverage has changed. And our approach is much more serious and consequential. It's as if the scales have suddenly fallen from our eyes. And in thinking about this, to some extent, I think it is self-interest, but I also think there's a qualitative difference to what's happening today. The assault on truth that we've seen in both countries has been escalated. And even as we cope with an increasingly violent world, this seems like a next level threat. Because we've already lost the security of our homes, or at least parts of our community, particularly in Tijuana. And when we talk about impunity, that means we've lost the security of due process of law. And yet, out of necessity or hope or optimism or denial, we've been working around these losses, looking past them. But now this feels like an assault on the next ring of freedoms. Freedom of speech, which we group with other critical freedoms that define us, freedom of assembly, the right to petition the government. So this is scary. It feels like the next pillar is falling. A friend of mine who's been a very successful businessman in Tijuana likes to say his secret has been this time machine that he has that shows him where the market is going. And that time machine was the US. By looking at the US, he could stay ahead of the trends coming to Mexico. So as I listen to today's conversation, I'm thinking about another time machine, one that tells us where the US is headed and how much we are looking at our future by looking across the border at what's happening today. And with that, I will turn it over to Rafael to begin our program.
Thank you, Jeff. As the director of the Center for U.S.-Mexican Studies at UC San Diego, I'm delighted to put this together with you, Jeff, and the San Diego Union-Tribune. We believe at UCSD that Mexican democracy is new. It's only been there for 2 decades, and also freedom of expression is new in Mexico. It's only been there for 20 years or so. So it is very important to strengthen Mexican journalism. In fact, it is necessary for strengthening Mexican democracy. So I'm delighted to launch this series of conversations with the San Diego Union-Tribune and to explore how can we strengthen Mexican journalism? How can we make sure that the scenario in Mexico is much more safe for them? So we have a wonderful panel, and I'm very happy and I'm very grateful to you, Wendy Fryer, Siria Gastelum, and Sergio Sarmiento, and Sonia de Anda. Let me briefly read their bios. Sonia de Anda is a journalist based in Tijuana who has over 28 years of experience. She currently works Esquina 32 Noticias and is a member of the group Sí, Yo Soy Periodista. And she tells me this is a group that it doesn't have hierarchies. It's a very horizontal group. And so she'll be with us briefly. And we also have Wendy Fryer. You know her, she's at the San Diego Union-Tribune. Wendy is an exceptional investigative journalist who covers politics, government, and education. She's a senior reporter at the San Diego Union-Tribune, where she covers and reports violence and politics in the San Diego-Tijuana border region. Wendy won SPJ's Sol Prize Award and responsible journalist in the Grand Golden Watchdog Award in 2017. Siria Gastelum is the Director of Resilience at the Global Initiative. Siria started documenting community responses to organized crime in her own native state of Sinaloa, Mexico, when she launched the GIR Resilience Project in 2017. Siria is an Emmy Award-winning journalist who has worked on radio, television, and print media, the United States and Canada. In 2008, she joined the United Nations office in Vienna. Welcome, Siria. We also have, and I'm delighted to introduce to you Sergio Sarmiento, my dear friend. Sergio Sarmiento is a Mexican journalist and writer. He was founding contributor to the newspaper El Financiero, and in 1994, he joined the newspaper Reforma. Currently, his column, Checkmate, is published in more than 20 Mexican newspapers. Of course, Sergio does radio and television, and I will say Sergio has become such a well-known journalism, not only in Mexico, but in the world, is because he works extremely hard. He's a perfectionist and he's a dear friend. Thank you, Sergio, for taking the time to be with us. So let's start. Since Sonia couldn't be with us, I interviewed her last night, and this is what she had to say. Please, could you show the video? And let me ask you, please go to the interpretation button, because I interviewed her in Spanish, so you could switch into English, and then you could listen to Sonia. It's a 7-minute interview, and then we'll come with our panel. Go ahead, Arturo, por favor. Arturo, can you show the video? Hola, Sonia, muy buenos días. Tú eres integrante del colectivo Yo Sí Soy Periodista, y como tú nos explicas, es un colectivo sin liderazgos, es una organización horizontal. Gracias por estar con nosotros. Has estado en medio de los acontecimientos de la violencia a periodistas en los últimos días. Te quisiera hacer una primera pregunta, Sonia. ¿Qué hay de nuevo en esta violencia a los periodistas del 2022? Este es un tema que ha estado en México por los últimos 10 años, pero ¿qué ves de nuevo? Y específicamente, ¿qué está pasando en nuestra región, en Tijuana, en Baja California?
Mira, lo nuevo es que en Tijuana, pues habíamos andado con la confianza de que ya no tocaban a los periodistas. Después del último asesinato que se dio de Francisco Ortiz Franco en el 2004, teníamos la falsa sensación de que los grupos criminales o los intereses de poder ya no se metían con nosotros, y de repente uno de nosotros es asesinado, pero lo nuevo es que se desata otro asesinato antes de que concluya la semana. Esa fue la parte que más nos cimbró, que nos demostró la vulnerabilidad en la que estamos, y que se demostró que prácticamente lo que veníamos advirtiendo hace más o menos 5 años se estaba comprobando, porque hace 5 años que nació este colectivo, precisamente fue para marcar la frontera entre los que ejercemos el periodismo y personas que hoy ejercen el derecho a la libertad de expresión, que son blogueros, influencers, pero que están sirviendo a intereses de crimen organizado, y que el gobierno mexicano los está protegiendo como si fueran periodistas. Esta parte la denunciamos, la presentamos, la documentamos, y de nada nos sirvió, porque veíamos venir que en cualquier momento este tipo de sujetos nos iban a poner en riesgo. En algún momento estuvimos amenazados por un bloguero que también estaba protegido y que pues no pasó del mal rato, pero veíamos venir esto hasta que se comprobó con la sangre de nuestro compañero Margarito Martínez, que fue expuesto por un bloguero que sin ningún tipo de consecuencia legal hasta ahorita lo presentó como el administrador de unas páginas que sirven a intereses de grupos criminales y que son anónimas y que siguen operando y que evidentemente Margarito pues no administraba. Entonces, por desgracia, se demostró lo que se comprobó nuestras preocupaciones y luego vimos cómo matan a Lourdes Maldonado en lo que creemos que es un contexto que fue aprovechado de manera política. Entonces, es parte de estos asesinatos que se empiezan a presentar los primeros días del 2022 y que va también aparejado con este discurso del presidente de la República.
Eso, justamente. Excellent, thank you, Sonia. And now let's start with you, Wendy, and then we go to you, Siria and Sergio. And basically, what I will ask you, I mean, the same question that I asked Sonia. What is new? We've been facing this violence against Mexican journalists for the last 10 years or so. What is new this year? What has changed, Wendy? And if you could tell us, I mean, how do you feel covering Tijuana? Do you feel safe all the time?
Sure. So, and I've been covering Tijuana not as much full-time as I have in the last recent years, but even way back 10 years ago in my career, I would sometimes come to Tijuana to do stories. And as far as what's new, I think there is, as Sonia mentioned, this real sense that anything could happen at any time. We sort of lost that sense of security that we had before, that journalists were somehow off limits for doing their job. And now with these recent murders of our colleagues, it just sort of shook our sense of security, basically. And I would say that, yes, I do feel relatively safe. Usually we all stay in a group. I was just talking actually the other day with a reporter from The Guardian who's here doing a story, and I was rolling back through all my messages with Margarito that I, had over the years, and I saw that we had covered this story back in January 2020, and I remember very distinctly that somebody told me to leave that scene. A guy who was, standing on the corner wearing red sneakers, red shirt, came up to me and told me it was a shooting of state police, and I was there the day after the police had been shot. And he came and said, you need to get out, you need to leave, right? Leave here, you shouldn't be here, and go away from this scene. Basically, he didn't want it covered. And so I did right away, of course, I left right at that moment. But there has always been sort of that sense that and that is my big concern right now, that the criminals that were just arrested this morning on suspicion of being responsible for Margarito's murder, that they will understand that perhaps their arrest is because of all this pressure that the journalistic community in Tijuana is placing on the government, on the authorities to make an arrest and to get justice. So these criminal groups might realize that that's happening because of all the pressure that we're putting, and in that way want to stop us from covering it, or want to, influence in some way by trying to silence us. So that is my big concern for security right now. And as Sonia said, there's also the issue with the Facebook bloggers and the influencers. When we were at a press conference for the Attorney General, just several weeks ago, I had asked if one of the suspects had prior criminal acts on his record. And one of these bloggers came over and stood right next to me and sort of put his phone sort of right next to me and in my face. And so there is this sense that, they want to kind of control the narrative in that way. And so it does feel a little unsafe.
Thank you, Wendy, for sharing with us your experiences there. We're also joined by Inés García. Inés García is the Punto Norte, and she's US-based journalist with 10 years of experience covering topics such as crime, immigration, human rights, and government. Welcome to you, Inés. Could you tell us, Inés, what is new in this violence against journalism? How you see the scene and how you see the response of the federal and the state and local government, Inés? What is the atmosphere for you covering Tijuana and organized crime?
Thank you so much, Rafael, and sorry for the delay. As Sonia was saying, I think there's a whole generation of journalists in Tijuana, maybe even including myself, who didn't actually live through the violence that on the beginning of the year 2000, Tijuana lived. I mean, I remember reading in magazines and in newspapers about Jesus Blancornela's attack, about Francisco Ortiz Franco's death, but it seemed like something that was very apart or very far from us. So what happened to Margarito and to Lourdes Maldonado, I think was like a warning or like a reminder that what we do, like the conditions where we develop our job are not safe. Sometimes we try to look over it because honestly, if we've been conscious all the time about this, it will be really hard to get out there and do our jobs. So I think like a bunch of us like didn't actually think about the risks. And sadly, Margarito's and Lourdes killings has forced us to see these risks and has forced us to reorganize. And because of us, as you were saying, we hadn't seen a very upfront answer from the federal and state governments. I mean, there's been some arrests, but information has been kept very secretly. I mean, in Lourdes Maldonado's hearings for the 3 people that are linked to her death, the hearings were private. Press was not allowed to be in. They say it's because they're trying to protect someone of some witness identity, but we know that we've been in very delicate cases, in very delicate hearings, and this has not been a reason before to make that private. So we are worried about how the government is actually handling this information. As Wendy was saying, like yesterday, we had the general attorney for Baja California in Tijuana. We asked him if there were any people detained, if there were some like search warrants, arrest warrants for Margarito's case. He said that soon we'll hear about it. And today we find out in Tijuana, since Colima, where the President López Obrador was holding his daily conference, we hear there are 5 people detained. And as Wendy is saying, we are very vulnerable right now. So it's kind of worrying to know that there are things going on in these cases that can expose us. As Wendy says, I feel the same way. I feel that some of these people may see us as responsible because there's such high levels of impunity in Tijuana that they may have felt that they could get away with it. And now that they're seeing this big movement claiming for justice, I think we can feel exposed as well, not only covering the story, but if there are going to be consequences from these criminal groups because of all the pressure that journalists are holding on these cases.
Thank you, Inés. Siria, you're from Sinaloa, but you travel the world. You work in a worldwide organization. What is new in this violence against journalists in Mexico, Syria? But also, I wonder if there's any place in the world, let's say Colombia, for example, that has done a good job in protecting journalists from violence.
Thanks again, Rafael, for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to be sharing this panel with all of you and having these conversations, as I believe like you all that there's a lot of stake here. And I think in the particular case of Mexico, things have changed. Like, we were talking about before, the media scenario has changed. 20 years ago, we couldn't say we really had freedom of expression. Apparently now there's more tolerance for dissent. There's media ownership has diversified, but also the appearance of these social media and these other actors that are not necessarily journalists have also increased the risk, as Wendy was saying. But also the criminal landscape has changed. I think, you know, and I remember this because in places like Tijuana and Sinaloa, this Pax Mafiosa, where, you know, if you are living in a territory which is controlled by one criminal organization, sometimes journalists felt that, you know, there was some sort of protection because, you know, they are from there, the narcos are from your community. So this was the whole idea. But now we've seen that these monolithic cartels or criminal organizations are no more. The criminal economies have diversified. They're more smaller organizations, more violence, more drugs, more guns. I mean, we're living in a different scenario. And obviously we're seeing the sad consequences of it. But when we look at the world, we have the Global Initiatives has this Global Assassinations Monitor. And what we look is to look at targeted assassinations of journalists, of environmentalists, politicians in these scenarios that have to do, like in Mexico, with organized crime. And these assassinations happen everywhere, unfortunately. But it is really remarkable to say that between 2019 and 2020, 22% of assassinations of media workers happen in Mexico. There's a huge disproportion there. And what is really, really interesting to me is that when people think of violence against journalists in Mexico, we're usually compared with countries in conflict, with Afghanistan, for example, you know, when you look at the numbers. But, and people maybe outside had this idea that maybe journalists in Mexico are being killed in crossfire by organized crime, when the reality is much more complex, because it also has to do with the participation of authorities as perpetrators of the violence against journalists in Mexico. But when we look at the world, and you know, we were asking about Colombia and other countries, there's this really interesting report that's very recent by Reporters Without Borders that analyzes the protection mechanisms of different countries, including Mexico, Colombia, I think Brazil is in it, I think Honduras. But the interesting thing of this study is that it shows how much in Latin America this is a common problem. What it found is like the mechanisms of protection. One things that they have in common is the lack of transparency, the lack of resources, the lack of inclusion of civil society in them, the lack of capacity, and the lack of political will. And this is all across the countries that were included in this study. I think only Brazil was the one that perhaps had more adequate funding. But there's more work, I would say, that Colombia has done in protecting environmentalists, protecting human rights defenders. There's a larger conversation, I feel, going on there, more participation of civil society, which we don't see in Mexico. But it is different. It is at a risk for journalists all over the world, but no doubt that the Mexican case is really particular, really worrying, and this is really an emergency and something that should concern us all.
Thank you, Siria. Sergio Sarmiento, you're an acute observer of Mexican politics. You've been observing the Mexican scene for a few decades now. So what is your take? Would you say that the current atmosphere it contributes to the increase of violence, that the wave of violence we're seeing against journalists in Mexico?
Well, first of all, thank you, Rafael, and thanks to the San Diego Union-Tribune for having me here. What's different right now is that we are getting a lot more journalists killed. I've been a journalist for 50 years. I started in 1971 when I was 17, and I've been working as a professional journalist ever since. We've always had killings of journalists. The main difference is that when Manuel Buendía or Jesus Blancornelas, who was a very good friend of mine, or Francisco Ortiz Franco was killed, it was a scandal. It was something that made headlines all over Mexico and abroad. And now there are so many journalists that are being killed that people have a hard time actually keeping track of the number of journalists being killed. Of course, Margarito and Lourdes Maldonado have been the most outstanding cases in this year. But the main difference is that last year we were, I believe, the second deadliest country for journalists with 6 murders that were actually certified of journalists. And we have 5 already this year, maybe a 6th already, but we're trying to determine whether the person killed is really a journalist or not a journalist. So the main difference right now is the number of journalists being killed. One thing that concerns me a lot is that, of course, we pay special attention to journalists, and for a good reason. If you kill the free press in a country, you actually are having a very detrimental effect on society. So that's why the killing of journalists is important. But sometimes we forget that what we're actually seeing in Mexico is a wave of killings, indiscriminate killings that's affecting the entire society. Last year, we had 33,000 murders throughout the year. 33,000 murders, that works out to be about 90 assassinations, 90 murders per day. This is something that should really concerns us. We are one of the deadliest countries in the world, not only for journalists, but for anyone. It's hard to tell how many journalists there are in Mexico because the definition varies from city to city, from state to state. But it's very likely that although a lot of Mexican journalists are being killed, it's not the deadliest profession in Mexico, even though we're the deadliest country in the world for journalists. I was talking to a taxi driver who was telling me, I mean, they kill more taxi drivers than they kill journalists in Mexico, or they kill more policemen, or they kill more just people in general terms than they're killing journalists. We do pay a lot of attention to journalists, and I believe it's right because it's something that we have to do as a society. But the main problem that we're having is the fact that Mexico is suffering a wave of violence that has actually gone unchecked for many, many years. And the process started really many years ago, probably in 2007. That's when we began to see the spike in killings in general in society. We also have, and this time is different, we have a government that doesn't pay lip service to journalists. And in fact, we have a president that actually criticizes journalists almost every day, who believes that he has the right to attack journalists from his tribune, from his position as president. And of course, a lot of people wonder whether this actually is facilitating the killing of journalists. From what I understand, and I try to pay attention to the actual circumstances of each one of the killings, there's no relationship between the positions of the government, which are of course quite upsetting to journalists, and there's something that we have to do something about. But there doesn't seem to be any relationship between the fact that we have a president who believes that journalists shouldn't be entitled to criticize him, just as the US had Donald Trump in the past. But I don't see any relationship actually right now between the killing of journalists and the fact that we have a government that is very hostile to the free press. I believe that we should be concerned about the killings of journalists, but we have to be more concerned about the wave of violence that is actually destroying the very fabric, the social fabric of my country, of Mexico. That's something that we have to do. I don't believe, by the way, in this position that we journalists should have better protection, that we should have bodyguards, or that we should have special treatment from the government. I believe the government should do an effort to actually control violence for everyone. Some journalists have had to live with bodyguards. Jesus Blancornelas actually had to live with military bodyguards for many years. I remember I used to visit him in Tijuana, and he kept on telling me that it was really something that destroyed his life, because he couldn't continue to do reporting if he was followed by military people all over the place. I myself had federal security, protecting me for a couple of years, and I've spent most of the time fighting with the government so that they would withdraw that protection from me. But I believe that what we're getting right now, that the real reason for concern is not that they're killing journalists in Mexico, even though this is really quite a tragedy and we should do something about each one of the cases, but the fact that killing comes cheap in Mexico nowadays, and for 5,000 pesos you can hire anyone to kill anyone, either a taxi driver or a journalist, and that's the real sad thing about what's happening to Mexico right now.
Thank you, Sergio. Let me remind everybody that we have a Q&A button, so please send us your questions, your comments. We would like to do this as interactive as possible. And there's, for example, Luis Manrique asking us, what would you consider are some of the root causes of the high volume of murders in Mexico? I will ask that question to all of you. But Wendy, let me go back to you. Do you believe that there's an effort on the part on Baja California's government and the federal government to protect Mexican journalists? I know that Alejandro Encinas, the Undersecretary for the Interior, was here yesterday. And do you see an important effort happening there? Do you think that's going to be meaningful?
Well, I do think that they're trying to appear like they are making an effort to address the problem. As far as the question from the audience, what the root causes are, I think a lot of it is poverty, and then obviously we have to recognize that the United States has a large role in exporting so many guns. Just this morning, they announced with the arrests of those people that were on suspicion of murdering Margarito, that those guns actually came from the United States. And so we have to recognize the United States' role in both consuming drugs that drives the drug trade and exporting the arms to Mexico. And then as far as I really appreciate what Sergio said, but as far as the government's comments about reporters, for example, when Mexico's president makes comments like that all reporters are chayeteros and stuff like that, those comments are specifically echoed by some of the people who are being threatening to us out in the streets. So when he makes comments about, sort of demeaning the work of reporters, the people that are being threatening to us out there, the bloggers and influencers or Facebookers, they are echoing those exact phrases to us. And so I do feel like it does have an impact. I feel like it sort of sets the tone that it's okay to take this threatening stance. And we have that problem in the United States as well, of course, as it was mentioned, that Trump has, said reporters are enemies of the state. And that gives people that they feel like they have some kind of license to mistreat reporters on the ground. And so I feel like that is something that is going on. And as far as the government protecting reporters, I mean, we have seen that system is not working, right? The mechanism has failed. Lourdes was under protection and she was still killed. And Margarito had asked for that protection and had not completed the process yet, but he was still killed. So we're seeing whatever effort is being made is not working.
Thank you, Wendy. Inés, you're what we call in Spanish a journal, una periodista de a pie. You've been covering for Seminario Z, you've been covering the streets of Tijuana. Let's imagine that Jeff lighted Santa Claus. What would you ask him for you to feel more protected, for you to feel safe? What are the 1, 2, 3 things that you think that should happen in Tijuana, in our region, for you to feel safe in covering, in literally doing your job?
Thank you, Rafael. Yeah, I think it's the situation in all of Mexico, specifically in Tijuana, is as Sergio was saying before, it's very linked to the high levels of impunity. I mean, in Tijuana, we've had more than 250 homicides on the first weeks of this year. Sadly, it's not the highest number. I mean, 2018 is still the deadliest year that Tijuana has seen. And also, even the numbers for 2021 were 80 homicides less than 22. So even if the government can say that there are less homicides, we still haven't seen more cases being solved, more people being prosecuted for these homicides, more sentence coming from these homicides. So I think that the first request, not only for journalists to be able to do our jobs in a safer environment, but for all people to feel safer. As Sergio was saying, I heard a lot of complaints when we had these protests for journalists being killed. People right now with social media, you can like see live the live reactions of people that are actually watching the live streaming or comments when you share your news on social media. And people are saying it's not only journalists, like all Mexico is being killed. I have a daughter who disappeared. My dad was killed 10 years ago, and we hadn't like have this case solved. So I think like the first step is to actually try to decrease these impunity levels. I mean, until we are not able to prosecute the responsibles for these killings. I mean, Margarito's case, I think, is one of the most heartbreaking stories, not only because Margarito meant a lot for all of us. I mean, he was an icon on the border covering violence, but because the gun that was used to kill him had killed 6 people before. And it's very hard not to stop and think, if that gun hadn't been used to kill Margarito, had we found out? I mean, had that investigation led to realize how many lives they took? So it's very complicated, like to start to make a list of things that will make us safer. But I think that if justice is not served, and if cases are not being investigated, like through the last consequences, and not only like not only on the like superficialmente, I mean like not in depth, but only like I think that if those cases are not investigated, there are not going to be safe conditions for journalists to keep doing our job. And maybe a second request would be, as Wendy would say, to change the narrative. I mean, for some reason, in some part of history, press, instead of being seen as an ally for people, it looks like, it seems like an enemy. It seems like people are very like upset with the job press is doing. There are a lot of these ideas that the press was used to serve the PRI and the PAN, and now that Morena is in charge, like every article or story that comes out about something that Morena governments are doing wrong, it looks like the easiest way to put it is like, oh, it's because the PAN pays you or the PRI pays you. So I think that changing these two things, their narrative against press, seeing as an enemy to the people, and the high levels of impunity in all of Mexico, those things that could change will make a safer environment for all of journalists, maybe not only in Tijuana, but in the rest of the country.
Thank you, Inés. Impunity and narrative, and what is your job? And I believe that that's why the San Diego Union-Tribune and us, we want to emphasize that without you guys, we will not have full democracy in Mexico, not in the US. And Jeff, please, yours is the floor.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Inés. That I do think those are topics maybe for the follow-up conversations, because I think you're really getting to some important questions there. I also wanted to ask, maybe this is for Sergio. I know that in Tijuana, among, I guess I would say, the establishment class, the coping mechanism of living among this violence is really to look past it. And as a publisher, I am, in constant contact with people concerned about the image of the city, concerned, in some ways, I think, legitimately about giving too much, centering the criminal element too much, looking past the good things of the city. And yet, like in the last month and a half, I've really been reconsidering the way we've covered the city and wondering, ethically, is it responsible to look past the murders of 2,000 people? And what is the journalistic role here to changing that the problems that are really roiling Mexico right now?
Well, those are, yeah, thank you. Those are very interesting questions, Jeff. And of course, I mean, I live in Mexico City, but I have a very close relationship with Baja California. I have a house in Ensenada. And so I have a lot of friends in Baja, in Tijuana, in Ensenada, in Tecate, all over the place. And of course, what you do when you living in an environment of violence is that you try to continue living your life. I mean, that's a normal human mechanism. There's a very good book by Tom Friedman. I think it was his first book about when he was a correspondent in Lebanon. And of course, you're seeing murders and you're seeing bombings all over the place, and you do your job, but you also want to live. You want to live your life. You only live once, and you have to you do look past on a lot of things that happen. Although that doesn't mean that you have to do it. As a journalist, you have to keep on saying. Of course, don't forget that we do have a problem. Tijuana has had a program that, in fact, I have supported in the past, which is Tijuana Innovadora. So I've given lectures there, and I've tried to show to Mexico and to the world that Tijuana is a very innovative, it's a very dynamic society. And of course, I do it. But that doesn't mean that as a journalist, I shouldn't be pointing out things and complaining. I was a very good friend of Jesus Blancornelas, who did that all the time, and who keep on showing Tijuana the ugly side of the city. I'm a great admirer of Adela Navarro, who's been doing that in Tijuana also for a number of years. Of course, our job as a journalist is to show that not everything is fine. We have to do it, but we also have to understand that the middle class in Tijuana and in Baja California, they're going to look past and they're going to try to keep on living their lives. That's human, and if when we do deal with violence, we also have to be perfectly clear as to what are the reasons. Wendy was mentioning, for example, the typical explanations that the Mexican government gives us. I mean, it's not our fault. The fault is the previous governments because they left us a very poor country. Oh no, the fault is of the United States because they have guns and the American guns come to Mexico. In fact, Secretary of Defense Luis Crescencio Sandoval this morning was saying, okay, we caught the 5 people who were involved in the murder of Margarito Martinez. And by the way, of course, everyone who's involved with Tijuana was hurt by the murder of Margarito. He was a very popular photographer. Everyone knew him and everyone loved him. And of course, he made it clear, okay, and the weapons were weapons from the United States. And of course, most of the weapons in Mexico come from the United States, but that's not the reason why Mexico is violent. I really like living across the border in Mexico. And for a time I was working in Ciudad Juárez. Juárez was a very violent city, and if you just cross the bridge to the United States and to El Paso, and the situation was totally different. However, in Mexico, guns have been banned since 1921. You have to have a special permission from the Secretariat of Defense to carry a weapon. And in Texas, you can carry a weapon unconcealed everywhere you go. However, when I was there in Juárez, there were 100 murders per 100,000 inhabitants per year, and there were only 2. And there were only 2 across the border in El Paso. So it's not just the weapons. There are a lot of other things that actually generate violence. And I think Inés is right on target when she says it's impunity. 99% of the crimes committed in Mexico are never solved, and about 94% of the murders never lead to any conviction, judicial conviction. When they do, very often they're innocent people who just used as as targets or as ways to show people that they've actually solved the cases. So I believe impunity is the real issue that we have here. And of course, about the changing of the narrative, I certainly agree with the fact that President López Obrador is doing a great disservice to journalism and to truth by attacking every critic and every journalist who writes anything critical about him every day. And, you know, I keep on doing it, of course, and everyone keeps on doing it because that's our job. We have to be critical of the government. But I just don't think that's the reason why journalists are being killed. I don't think that Margarito was killed because of something the president said. I don't think Lourdes Maldonado was killed because of anything that that López Obrador said. I know that Jaime Bonilla, the former governor of Baja, hated her guts. That doesn't make him a criminal, of course. But certainly we have to investigate him. And of course, I'm absolutely irate about the fact that López Obrador has exonerated him just because he's his friend. But I just don't think that Lourdes Maldonado or Margarito Martinez Esquivel or any of the journalists who've been killed this year were killed because of the president's absolutely irresponsible declarations against journalists.
Thank you, Sergio. I will come back to you, Wendy, but Siria, you've been covering Sinaloa, your home state. Is there any lesson from that state? I mean, that state has had a tremendous violence over the years, but it's like more stable than Baja California. It's Sergio, thank you for giving us, I mean, this the large picture, but yes, Latin America, not only Mexico, has become the single most deadliest region on earth. We basically monopolize about 35% of the world's homicide, and Mexico, unfortunately, has become the fourth deadliest country of Latin America. So, I mean, yes, that's the picture, and it's awful. Back to you, Siria. What is your take on Sinaloa? And if there are any lessons within Mexico that we could try to use here or some other places?
Thank you. Actually, I totally relate with what Jeff was saying, because I feel like in Culiacan sort of happens the same thing. I mean, the violence is so prevalent. A way to cope is like you roll up your window, you go and live behind your walls in your secluded neighborhood, far away from where all this violence is. And it's just really what people have to do to keep on living. The problem is that now the violence has reached that middle class, that you cannot just roll out your window, that wherever you live, somebody close to you is going to disappear, is going to get murdered, or something's going to happen. These cases are not isolated, and nobody is safe anymore. And this also happened to journalists with the killing of Javier Valdez in 2017. You know, like there was this perception also that it was safe, and then until it wasn't, and now, I mean, after the Culiacanazo, also there's, you know, legitimate reasons for population to be in a constant state of fear. But I, you know, being from there, and I don't live there, but all my family lives there, I keep going back. I also worry about the image of this beautiful place full of amazing, hardworking people that we give to the world, because that's not all the story. And I do also wonder, how can we cover all this without losing on these other stories that are also about different things, but they are related. And in fact, this is how the Resilience Project was founded. And the question was, how can we retell these stories in a way that makes sense to all of us? In a way, even to question, to take the victims out of their boxes, to take the perpetrators out of the boxes, and have a conversation as a society where we all want the same thing. And you were asking for some examples, and I think part of this project, and it's something for me really symbolic, when we did the second Resilience Dialogues in Culiacan, Noroeste, which is a very, very important regional newspaper in Sinaloa. They work with these collectives, with these NGOs, local journalists, and the collectives of mothers of missing people. And they had a whole mural in this newspaper, which is like downtown in a very a popular street full of restaurants where, you know, it's where the middle class goes on the weekends to have a drink and a nice dinner. But now there it is, this newspaper with this huge wall with faces of missing people. And for me, that was such an important stand, you know, in bringing the stories in a different way, in making us really feel part of this conversation, because it is a conversation that affects everybody. And we've been doing really interesting stuff, some of it with our partners as University of San Diego through the Mexico Violence Resource Project as well, in putting together journalists, the mothers of missing people, artists, business people, to have a conversation and not just let the journalists alone, also in like, oh, how can we cover this, how we can talk about this without, you know, really scaring everybody out and adding to the psychosis. So at least I can say there's that reflection there, and that curiosity and willingness to come together and find these narratives together.
Thank you, Siria. Wendy, back to you. We're closing. We have 7-8 minutes to go. So why don't you give us your last thoughts about, I mean, how can we improve the situation? What a San Diego Union-Tribune, a US-based newspaper, very interested in Mexico, doing a wonderful coverage of Tijuana and what we call Calibaja, and a university think tank like us at US Mex can do to help you guys. I mean, we know that without you, we're lost. We will not have information. We don't know. I mean, you'll improve our decision making. So tell us. I mean, what is what you're expecting from us? And again, as you know, we're going to be doing this every month. We're going to explore avenues to help to strengthen journalism in Mexico. And in the end, we'll end it up with this journalist award. Sergio, what you mentioned, and you also, Inés, that we need a new narrative. Yes, one of our partners is Pepe Galicot, because he's been very influential in trying to improve the narrative of Tijuana. It's not only about violence. This is a thriving economy, a place that has attracted so many migrants, and because of that, is just an innovative place. Wendy, back to you. Your last thoughts.
Thanks, Rafael. I just wanted to really highlight what Inés was saying and Sergio was saying about the impunity, so that maybe the more US audience can understand a little bit better. When we talk about the people that get arrested for the crimes, we're talking about that those are not necessarily the people who were the author of the crimes. So for example, the people who were arrested for Lourdes Maldonado's homicide, they say they got paid $3,000 US dollars to crime. That's not the person who decided to go kill Lourdes. And so there's a lack of confidence in Mexican society that the correct person, the person likely of power and the person likely with a lot of money, is sitting there saying that they have the power to go kill who they want to. And so that is what we're talking about impunity that needs to be addressed, is that there needs to be a confidence among the society that the person who is actually responsible for the crime, who ordered the crime, is going to be held responsible. And right now, I don't think that we're there yet. And I don't think we have a whole lot of hope that that's going to be happening in these cases.
Thank you, Wendy. Inés?
Thank you so much, Rafael, and thank you to everyone. I think that for journalists in Tijuana, we've had to face like the real risks of doing our jobs. I mean, these are things that we've known for a long time. As Siria was saying, as Sergio was saying, as Wendy was saying, we know there's a lot of violence. We know there's a lot of impunity. We know that anyone can be a victim of a crime. But suddenly, when you lose 2 of your colleagues in less than a week, you feel more threatened than before, and you feel more vulnerable than before. And I think that in Tijuana, there's been a real effort, as Sonia was saying before, from Yo Sí Soy Periodista and groups of colleagues that are trying to start a conversation on what do we need to get done to feel safer. We know that we may not receive like the safest conditions possible from the government, but what we can do to protect ourselves. And we've been trying to get more in touch between each other, like in force of network of information, let everybody know when we go and cover something that is risky. I mean, what we did last week when President López Obrador came to Tijuana, we wrote a letter and we organized to get it read, to read it in his platform, like this national platform that has been used before to attack journalists. It was now like our opportunity to use it, but to say for what we were feeling and what we were going through. So I think that there's gonna be still like more interesting things that come from the journalist group. I think that we are finding new ways to connect, and we're finding new ways to let everybody know how we feel doing our job, and that we are not done doing it, that we're gonna continue doing it, even though these risks are still there. But we're finding the way like to heal from these 2 cases in Tijuana specifically that really hurt us, and to keep doing our job maybe safer and maybe more connected between us than before.
Thank you, Inés. Sergio?
Well, I think the role that institutions like the Center for U.S.-Mexican Studies or the San Diego Tribune, San Diego Union-Tribune is very important. We should have people in the world understand what's happening in Mexico, the violence to journalists, and the general violence that affects everyone. I mean, not everyone can tell you exactly why we have that violence, but you know, we have to keep on exploring that, and we have to keep pressuring the government to do its job, and its main job is to protect citizens in general terms. At the same time, as a journalist, for me, it is very important that we continue making understand President López Obrador that he can't attack journalists just because he doesn't like what they're saying, that the role of a journalist is to criticize the government, and that of course we might be wrong, but it's better to actually present information or present arguments that contradict what we're saying, rather than attacking journalists or asking the US government to support, for example, the support that it gives to institutions like Mexicanos contra la Corrupción y la Impunidad, which has done great work in journalism over the past 2 years. I think those 2 issues are different, but I think we have to fight violence on the one side, and we also have to fight a president who wants to become the biggest censor Mexico has seen in decades.
Thank you, Sergio. Siria, your last words, and then back to Jeff Light.
I'm just going to be really brief because I agree with everything that you guys have said. I think authorities in Mexico City do set the tone. We're talking about a big chunk of the aggressions to journalists coming from authorities. So if the main authority does not speak in a way that this is something that should concern authorities, then we have no hope. But my hope is also in civil society, in academia. We should really work together with journalists. You know, when people say, why are journalists more important than people? Of course, everybody, where it is a real crisis in Mexico, violent of homicides and disappearances. But the journalists are the ones that are going to help us keep authorities accountable. They're going to help us understand how this organized crime is infiltrating our governments. So we need them if we want to solve this big, enormous challenge together. So I do thank the opportunity of this space, Rafael, and this is our offering to work together with academia, with journalists, and do something about it, because we can just not let it go.
Thank you, Siria. Jeff Light, you have the last words.
Well, first let me say, Siria, I think what you're saying is very interesting to me, because it gets to this question I have about the proper journalism for the moment. And this idea of having an integrated conversation that accounts for the violence and the rest of society together is something that we really haven't mastered yet. So I'm very interested to hear more about that. So we should look into that in further sessions with this group. And I also heard some other themes about the role of social media in the decay of the information system. I think that's super important. The role of the government in the legitimacy of the conversation and the legitimacy of democracy with elections approaching. I think that has great bearing on both countries. So there's plenty to explore. Rafael, I wanted to thank you for putting this together. I think it's been a terrific session, and I'm really looking forward to hearing more in the weeks to come and understanding today's news in light of today's conversation as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jeff. We're delighted to partnership with you. And thank you, Wendy Fry. Thank you, Sergio Sarmiento. Thank you, Inés García. And thank you, Siria Gastelum, to share with us your thoughts, your experience. And we'll try to do our best because we believe that is very, very important that we strengthen security for Mexican journalists and in general for Mexico. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you.